So beginning in March 2020, we had somewhere around 50 million U.S. K-12 students displaced from their classrooms.
Over the past year, these school closures have led to substantial losses for millions of children all across the country, academically, socially, mentally, physically.
We're going to continue to see an uptick in the number of families choosing to take their kids out of district schools or to not enroll them from the beginning if they are, say, entering pre-K or kindergarten. We're seeing the call from the American Academy of Pediatrics, mask wearing for all students and staff in the public school system, regardless of vaccination status. We have the data around youth mental health has really been harmed due to the lockdowns and the pandemic policy over the past year, mainly due to isolation of kids. School closures certainly had a piece of that, but it was more than just school shutdowns. It was the fact that children and adolescents were disconnected from their communities in every way. They weren't able to gather with their peers at local parks or museums or libraries or restaurants because for so long these were shut down.
You've seen in Clark County Public Schools, the 5th largest school district in the nation, a doubling of student suicides relative to the previous school year.
I think we're going to be seeing the impact of these pandemic policies for years to come.
Yeah, there are a couple of reasons why the government school system has not done a very good job in the past year when it comes to responding to the pandemic. One of it has to do with red tape. They have so many regulations and it's a huge behemoth system that they may just not be able to adapt in time, whereas the people in the private sector and the private schools and people seeking out pandemic pods were able to right away, if they had the resources to do so, seek out alternative options, and they didn't have to worry about as many burdensome government regulations in doing so. The second reason that the government school system has been slower to adapt and just not doing as good of a job when it comes to adapting to the effects of the pandemic is that it had to do a lot with incentives. That private schools, again, fought to reopen. Public school teachers unions fought for the opposite, and I think it's because one of these sectors gets your money regardless of whether they open their doors for business.
It really catalyzed, I think, a moment for parents to take a closer look at what their kids were learning in school or what they were not learning in school and realize that they might have other options.
For example, since 1960, we've increased inflation-adjusted real per-pupil education expenditures in K-12 public schools in the United States by 280%. Again, that's adjusted for inflation. And our outcomes have essentially remained stagnant. And we've seen a lot of this money, and the problem is that the monopoly doesn't have any particularly strong incentive to spend those additional dollars wisely. And so they essentially add more to bureaucracy over time instead of funneling money into the classroom where it might matter the most for students. The way that I've put it is that COVID didn't break the public school system. It was already broken in a lot of ways. The past year simply shined a spotlight on the main problem with K-12 education in America, which happens to be a long-existing, massive power imbalance between the public school monopoly and individual families. And thankfully, families are now fighting back to get some of their power back in order to find options for their children right now.
The teachers' unions, certainly over the past year, were the ones most responsible for keeping schools closed. In fact, Corey DeAngelis and other researchers at Brown discovered that it was teacher union influence more than virus rates or concerns about virus transmission in various communities that determined whether or not schools reopened. In fact, the Brown researchers also discovered that in communities that had a high rate of Catholic schools, private Catholic schools, in those counties, those public schools were more likely to reopen for in-person learning because the private schools, the Catholic schools, were open for in-person learning. So it was that competition factor that is so important in all areas and all markets and industries, and certainly we saw this with education as well.
Also other hypocrisies where you had the Chicago Teachers Union board member in Puerto Rico vacationing in person while tweeting against reopening the schools for their employees in the system. Well, if it's safe enough for you to travel to Puerto Rico and vacation in person, why isn't it safe enough for you to return to work in person?
Zoom schooling was sort of this ad hoc reaction to school closures that most school districts weren't ever set up to accommodate remote learning. Teachers weren't trained or weren't sort of willing to go into remote learning.
Because of Zoom learning, if we can even call it learning, I'd rather call it Zoom instruction or a Zoom remote environment for children to log into, is that some families were getting calls from the police and having police show up to their households because the children in some cases had just like a Nerf gun behind them in the picture or maybe a BB gun on their wall. And then some of those children were getting in trouble as if they had brought a gun to school. And so there was a lot of government interference coming in with a lot of these misunderstandings when it came to Zoom learning as well.
As the school reopening plan sort of fell through in many places beginning in the fall, parents just said, we're not going to put up with this.
There was a Gallup survey, for example, early on in the pandemic that estimated that we would see a reduction in the public school system of about 7 percentage points. We currently have about 82% of the school-age population in government-run schools in the United States. And Gallup estimated a 7 percentage point reduction in that proportion of students, which would mean millions of students fleeing the traditional school system. And then we started to get more hard data from individual state departments of education. And I will say at Chalkbeat, I believe Matt Barnum was the one that compiled data from, I want to say 33 different states, at least 33 different states, finding that the actual percentage of students leaving the traditional public school system in those states has dropped by anywhere from 3 to 5 percentage points on average, which again is millions of students leaving the system.
Overall, we saw a tripling of the homeschooling rate in the previous academic year, 2020 to 2021, from pre-pandemic levels. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, now more than 11% of U.S. K-12 students are being homeschooled, which is over 5 million kids.
We're seeing for the first time in modern U.S. history a mass exodus from the traditional public school system.
I think the bright side is that parents are really back in charge. They're re-empowered to guide their child's education in ways that were unimaginable before the pandemic. We see skyrocketing rates of support for school choice policies, and many states have implemented legislation this year to expand school choice programs that parents are really clamoring for. They want alternatives to an assigned district school, and those alternatives are continuing to expand thanks to public policy embracing school choice, as well as education entrepreneurs, including online learning entrepreneurs and other visionary educators that are opening private schools or low-cost alternatives to school. I think we'll continue to see that grow, and families have more choices, more options for their kids.